Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the international affairs, foreign policy, and global development community, and world news aficionados of all stripes. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. On April 22nd and 23rd, the White House hosted a Climate Leaders Summit, which featured more than 40 world leaders. Joe Biden kicked off the summit with a major announcement that the United States had set a target to reduce by 50% its carbon emissions by the year 2030. This is an ambitious emissions reduction target and one that lends support to the Paris Agreement goal to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. On the line with me to discuss the significance of the White House announcement and its implications for climate diplomacy is Pete Ogden. He is Vice President for Climate and the Environment at the United Nations Foundation, and we kick off with a discussion of some of the major announcements made at this summit, including from key U.S. allies. We also discuss what this summit means for the big event on the climate change diplomacy calendar this year, and that is the UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, Scotland in November, known as COP26. It is at this conference that the parties to the Paris Agreement are to formally present their national climate action plans to get to that Paris Agreement goal of limiting warming by 1.5 degrees. And as Pete Ogden explains, this White House summit did generate some important momentum to that end. I think you'll appreciate this conversation. It offers a great overview of what happened at this White House Climate Summit and what it means for the future of climate diplomacy. And just one quick note, a big thank you to everyone who has been leaving reviews of the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever it is that you listen to the show. I so appreciate it. By leaving a review, you help other people discover the show. So thank you. All right, now here is my conversation with Pete Ogden of the United Nations Foundation.
Yeah, the big announcement from President Biden was the U.S.'s new, what they call the nationally determined contribution inside the Paris Agreement, which is essentially our new national greenhouse gas reduction target. And it was unknown. People didn't know. It wasn't something that was previewed on the campaign or anything like that. No one knew what the 2030 target would be. And there was just a lot of anticipation. And frankly, there's a lot of hope from the global community and from the kind of climate community in the United States that they would see themselves to a path of 50% reduction below 2005 levels by 2030. And they came through. They ended up announcing a 50 to 52% target for 2030. So essentially, a commitment to have greenhouse gas emissions from the United States in the next 9 years.
And it's worth maybe emphasizing or describing that these nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, you will hear people just say in climate diplomacy circles, are the cornerstone of the Paris Agreement. It is each country's national action plan on climate that they bring to the table that collectively would put the world on a path towards 1.5 degrees limit of greenhouse gas emissions and warming. Is that right?
That's correct.
So we could do like a whole episode on what the domestic implications of this announcement by Joe Biden entails. Could you just maybe briefly, though, sketch out what it requires of American society and the U.S. government to actually achieve that 50% reduction by 2030?
Sure. Well, there's no single route to getting there. I think, this administration hasn't spelled out exactly what the sort of suite of tools it's going to use, and how exactly to deploy them. But it'll be some combination, certainly, of investments that we're seeing proposed in the president's infrastructure plan, which invests heavily in things like electric vehicle charging stations and other infrastructure that would be the cornerstone of a clean energy economy with this kind of reduced greenhouse gas pollution. But it'd also be a combination of regulatory policy and potentially legislation. There's inside the president's infrastructure bill is a proposal for a national clean energy standard for the United States. So we don't know exactly what form it's going to take, but it'll be some combination of those tools.
It was, I think, very deliberate that the Biden administration chose this climate leaders summit that they hosted to make this big announcement on the US NDC on the 50% reduction by 2030. What sort of impact did that have on the discussions over the past few days during that climate summit?
Oh, well, it absolutely sort of set the tone. I mean, again, I think that no one knew. There was a very closely held secret, or maybe it was just a very very recently arrived upon definitive decision by the administration. It was, I think, met with a recognition that the United States and this administration is going to be extremely serious about climate change. I mean, it's something he had talked about a great deal. Clearly, the administration, as he'd been staffing it and building it up, had every indication that this would be the case. But for the international community, it was really focused on what this all amounted to. And it's hard to put all the pieces together, even if you're in the United States. But for other countries, the idea that it would all be consolidated into this number inside the Paris Agreement was really, is really the point of convergence. I mean, this is the agreement to which the United States is now, had been absolutely central in crafting, now has re-entered, and this was that moment in which people were going to sort of react to what that would look like for this administration. And again, I think that everyone clearly came away with the sense that this is clearly a priority, and it's going to have to drive a lot of the president's agenda for the next 4 to 8 years if he's going to be able to deliver on it.
So what sort of announcements of note did we hear at the summit from other countries? I mean, it's my understanding that some other countries also made, similarly ambitious announcements at the summit, used the summit to kind of be the place where they would kind of tell their peer countries that this was their national climate action plan.
Yeah, I mean, it was encouraging to see that several other countries had sort of stepped up in a similar manner. The key one of the key focus points for the year in terms of the Paris Agreement and is this establishment of your 2030 targets and making sure that they are sufficiently robust and in line with the ultimate goal of that agreement. And to date, while a lot of countries had made commitments or had announced their intention to raise their commitments at some point this year, among the major economies, developed and developing, there hadn't been a great deal of positive movement. I mean, you had the EU and the UK both moved very aggressively toward the tail end of last year in that direction, but that was about it. And so the fact that the United States has kind of moved itself into that position also, I think, helped to bring forth some other countries' redoubled efforts. So, Japan moved its targets up from, in the mid 20s to percent by 2030, almost doubling it to 45% up to 50% emission reduction by 2030. I mean, it's a huge jump for one of the world's largest economies. Canada also significantly increased its NDC up 50% from a 30% target to 40 to 45% by 2030. So those were big commitments that really helped to move the needle. I mean, there was an analysis by an organization that sort of tracks the extent to which these national commitments are adequate to meeting the Paris Agreement, and they said that just the announcements yesterday from those two countries and others, closed the gap by 10 to 15% over what was needed to really get on a true under 2 degree path globally. So, things did happen.
Just based on what you're saying, it sounds to me like, from a diplomatic point of view, this was a success. I mean, the Biden administration clearly sought to use the convening power of the White House to press other countries, allies really, to make some commitments to follow their own commitment. And, it seemed like it worked. It was a gamble, but it seemed like it paid off.
Yeah, it did. I mean, I think they got it, and and not only did the countries, they're as you say, they're these allies countries like Japan and Canada, who clearly really value having a strong relationship with the United States. It makes sense that they would also then see this as a real opportunity to find an area of joint success. But you also have to keep in mind he invited 40 plus leaders, including the whole G20. And they all showed, you know,
Mm-hmm.
President Putin, President Xi, President Bolsonaro, right? They all came. And I think, again, that itself is, a demonstration of global leadership. I think that the administration is going to feel, really good about. Now, is it surprising that those countries don't necessarily all want to make a big climate announcement at President Biden's summit, considering everything else going on in the relationships? No. I mean, countries want to make these announcements at the time and place that's most advantageous to them and consistent with their domestic political messages and overall their strategies more broadly. But I think that the fact that they all came, again, shows that they are still part of this big process. With the United States back in it, really for the first time in 4.5 years.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting just to see, she attend it. This was, I think, the culmination of some diplomatic work by John Kerry, who was in China just ahead of the announcement that she would attend the climate summit. I mean, it seems to be a validation of the idea that while the United States and China will butt heads on several issues, democracy in Hong Kong, the South China Sea, the situation of the Uyghurs, competition globally more generally, there is this opportunity for collaboration on the climate. And even though, as you said, that she didn't make any like big announcements, the fact that he showed was, I think, a significant demonstration of a willingness on the part of the Chinese and the United States to work together on this at least one issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the hope, and we'll have to see. I mean, it's very interesting if you think back to the high water mark of U.S. China cooperation on climate was in the run up to the Paris Agreement, an agreement that was really, fundamentally built because it had to be to accommodate the two largest emitters, China and the United States, right? I mean, that was something that the Kyoto Protocol predecessor, agreements couldn't do, and the U.S. and China worked very hard to with the global community to find something that would really work for everybody. And not long after that agreement was ratified, went into force, the United States bailed on it. And they have President Trump walk away. And, interestingly, that was a moment where, you can imagine the roles are reversed. It's a difficult moment, right? If we had President Clinton and all of a sudden China said, we're out of this agreement, what would we do? And, it's interesting because China stayed in. And they said that very, very quickly. I mean, even before President Trump was even inaugurated, they said that they're not that the agreement, their commitment to climate change was remained firm. And I think that really did help to retain the overall integrity of the agreement during the 4-year essentially a 4-year absence of the United States from the global climate dialogue. And
it would have
so it held
collapsed
together.
if China. I mean, if China used the opportunity to
That's the
withdraw
question,
from
right? Was it is it a jailbreak? And other countries follow out, and they didn't do it. They and other countries didn't as well. But that would have been a real disaster. And we would be, unfortunately, now probably in a situation where President Biden would have to be in the world of trying to rebuild a new agreement. And that's fortunately not where we are. We're in a totally different phase, a phase of delivery on that agreement. And I think that's the big question now. I mean, you've seen what the United States is committed to. Most at this point, basically all of the G7 has now re-upped its 2030 targets. So now the question is, how can we move the needle with China, India, and the other major emerging economies over the next few months before the kind of big culmination in Glasgow, where the annual climate conference. Well, it was annual until last year.
It was supposed to be last year.
It was supposed to be last year. We got an extra year.
Well,
and frankly, with the change of administration here, it probably all worked out for the best.
So I wanted to ask you then, this was clearly this climate leaders summit was clearly a big moment in the road leading up to like the big moment, the meeting in Glasgow this fall. Are there other sort of interim steps and interim key kind of moments and inflection points between now and the Glasgow summit that we should be looking out for, that you'll be monitoring for?
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point, because it's not about negotiations anymore, right? We're not trying to craft a global agreement. We have it. So instead, moments and a lot of it that had really helped to shape the kind of outcomes that under the Obama administration that they pursued in the G7 and G20, to the extent they were pursuing climate objectives. It was very much shaped with that in mind. And now we're not there. We're talking about, and I think these same moments now get to think about what can they do to really help to accelerate this global transformation. So I'm watching in the G7, G20, at the General Assembly this September. The bank meetings, moments where countries are really trying to chart a post-COVID economic recovery. What are they doing? How are they investing their time, resources, diplomatic weight to try to steer the world onto this path by November, where we again see we see a trajectory to get to that 2-degree goal.
And I mean, you mentioned this earlier, but the key kind of things I think that are outstanding, that are unknown, are the extent of China and India's ambitions in revising their NDCs in advance of the Glasgow meeting. I mean, do you have any sense or indication of what or when we can expect from those two countries?
Well, in the case of China, they used the General Assembly last year as a moment to make a very significant climate announcement, which is that they would be carbon neutral by 2060, and that by setting that long-term goal in advance of them establishing their upcoming 5-year plan, suddenly you had 2 data points, and you could start to chart. Well, what would you need to be at by when? And they also indicated the time that they were going to be able to peak emissions before 2030 as part of this and begin a descent downward. So suddenly there's a lot more near-term relevance to their target, because for it to align with the 2060 net zero, you have to start reaching that tipping point more quickly. So I think that seems like that's been a moment in the past that they've liked to use to make these announcements. So it may be that we wait till then to hear whether that's the case. And India as well. I think they may choose to use that moment too. Though the calculations obviously are, as I said before, I think the timing is very much linked to what their domestic, political cadence is in terms of elections and other considerations they have.
I think also central to India and China's commitments on climate, not just India and China, but many other countries around the world, including countries in Europe and Eastern Europe, and also other countries of the developing world, is this question of coal. and what to do about the future of coal. Did this climate leaders summit point to any potential resolution on what to do about coal in the future?
Well, not directly, but I think if you look at the kind of commitments, you realize that directionally we are entering a phase in which to meet these targets that countries are setting for themselves, they are either explicitly or implicitly looking at phasing out coal in their energy mix. I mean, you have China actually saying for the first time that post in their following 5-year plan, so covering the 2020 26 through 2030 period, that they will be declining coal use. And again, on the one hand, you could say, well, of course you can do the math. You can't start, if you're going to peak and reduce emissions, you got to start cutting coal use. But they hadn't done that before. I think that was a recognition. They also mentioned, again, one of the bigger issues that kind of looms over a lot of these discussions when it comes to finance, which is the ongoing financing of overseas coal projects that China does extensively through the Belt and Roads Initiative, which is essentially locking in coal in a number of countries across South Asia, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere. And that's become more and more of a concern. The United States has pledged to end all public subsidies for overseas coal financing. That was a position that the Obama administration had taken on, and President Biden's reviving. But you've seen another number of other countries now follow suit. South Korea actually announced officially that it would halt all future financing for overseas coal projects. Japan is very close. They're not quite there, but they're really almost out of that business, which would really isolate China and really put a focus on them and the Belt and Road Initiative to see whether there could be a kind of global pressure to redirect that financing away from coal and towards cleaner, more sustainable energy sources.
I mean, it's just amazing to think how quickly momentum has shifted just in the last year on climate front, and the extent to which U.S. leadership is responsible for that shift.
It matters a lot, and that's not to say. I mean, I think one thing that's good to note though is the Biden administration is re-entering, but in a very aligned way with what the world and what the leading countries on this issue have been pushing for the past year. So, they came in, they're really putting their oar, and it's a big oar, but it's in the water and rowing in the same direction. They're not setting different goals, right? I mean, you've had a huge amount of work done in the EU and the UK have shown, a lot of leadership on this issue, as have others. And I think it's great when you have everybody, people pulling in this direction, and then you get this great surge of the second largest emitter, a global power like the United States to sort of get on board. And I think that's what we're getting, this really great little lift right off the bat here. I mean, again, 100 days ago, we weren't even in the Paris Agreement. Mm-hmm. And yet, the world really continued to take significant action. So I think, again, it is amazing what the difference it can make when the United States switches from a position of obstructionism to being one on the side of progress.
Well, Pete, thank you so much for your time and helping us make sense of this Climate Leaders Summit. And thank you for being a faithful listener to the show. I always love it when listeners come on the show as guests. It's sort of how it's supposed to work. So thank you.
Thanks so much. Honor to be here.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Pete. Now, I was sincere at the end of that conversation when I said this is how it is supposed to work. This show over the last many years has built up a great community around it, and that includes some really interesting people in the foreign policy, international affairs space, and I love it when I have listeners of the show as guests on the show. So thank you to Pete. All right. We'll see you next time. Bye.